All right. Want to get a handle on anxiety and phobias? Perfect. Because today we're going deep into the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook. And we're skipping the theory, going straight for like the what can I do about this stuff.
That's a classic for a reason. Really gets into those practical strategies.
So our goal today is to get you recognizing those anxious feelings, sure, but then actually using some of these techniques. Think you're ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. This workbook makes a really important distinction.
Yeah.
Like having everyday anxieties, totally normal.
Yeah.
But when it's in control, like running your whole life,
Yeah.
that's where we get into disorders.
Yeah. It's all about the intensity and how much it's messing with your life, you know? The workbook even says if you didn't feel anxious about potential loss or failure, something would be wrong.
Right. Little anxiety can be a good thing sometimes. Okay, so one thing that I found super interesting was how the book digs into all these different things that contribute to anxiety.
Yeah.
It's not just like all in your head, right?
Definitely not. Not even just your body either. It's way more complex, like layers, heredity, brain chemistry, stuff from when you were a kid, even stress you're dealing with right now, all plays a role.
Like, wow, what's the biggest factor for me? Makes you think,
Mhm.
even with identical twins, if one twin has a phobia, there's only like a 30 to 50% chance the other one will develop the same one. So your environment, that matters a lot.
And I think what's cool is how the workbook kind of brings all this together. It's pushing for tackling anxiety on every level. Body, mind, your emotions, even that feeling of like purpose in life.
This is where it gets really interesting, right? They call it holistic recovery because you can't just fix one part and think, oh, good, I'm all better.
Nope, it's all connected. It even talks about how sometimes people will be doing better physically, mentally, even emotionally, but there's still this emptiness. Like maybe you're missing a direction in life, and that can actually make anxiety worse.
So finding your why, that sense of purpose can be a huge part of getting better.
That's what they're saying. It ties everything together.
Now, let's get to the good stuff. What can you actually do about this? The workbook is packed with techniques, and it goes way beyond just like sitting around talking about your feelings.
It's super action-oriented, which I think a lot of people will appreciate.
So for example, chapter 6, that's all about handling panic attacks right when they happen. Then chapter 7 dives into exposure therapy, which is basically facing your fears little by little. Super important for phobias.
Yeah, that gradual exposure is huge when it comes to phobias. It's not about erasing fear completely. It's more like retraining your brain to see those scary things as not such a big deal.
So like dipping your toe in a cold pool, then slowly going deeper.
Exactly. And then you've got chapters 8 and 9. They get into changing those negative thought patterns, that inner critic everyone's got.
Or I know that one all too well.
Yeah.
And those thoughts can totally spiral out of control.
Yeah.
It's like this constant loop of, what if this happens? Oh no, I'm going to mess up.
They call them cognitive distortions. Basically, just a fancy way of saying that when we're anxious, we don't always think straight. Like we overestimate how likely it is that something bad will happen, or we jump to the worst possible scenario. They call that catastrophizing.
Right. So step 1 is just notice those thoughts. Become aware of that inner critic.
Exactly. Once you can spot them, you can start to challenge them. Like if you're thinking, I'm going to fail this presentation, ask yourself, wait, what evidence do I actually have for that?
It's like they lose power when you actually shine a light on them.
Totally. And then you can start swapping those negative thoughts for ones that are more realistic, more helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of I'm going to fail, it becomes I prepared for this, I'm going to do my best.
That shift from self-criticism to like being kind to yourself, that's huge. But honestly, it's so hard to do that all the time. It's like we're programmed to focus on the bad stuff.
It does take practice, no doubt. But the workbook stresses that you can change those thought patterns. You're not stuck with them.
Okay, that's actually really encouraging to hear. Now, the book also shares these stories about how people have used these techniques in their own lives, which I thought were really powerful. Like Susan, who figured out how to stop those full-blown panic attacks by catching the early warning signs and kind of breaking the cycle.
That's super important. The sooner you step in, the less those symptoms can control you. It's like catching a snowball before it turns into a giant avalanche rolling downhill.
So true. And her story shows just how powerful those simple techniques can be, like calling a friend to talk, getting some exercise, or journaling to process those emotions.
Even just changing your self-talk in that moment, instead of, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack, it's, okay, I can handle this. These feelings will pass.
Love that. Okay, another one that stuck with me was Steve, the guy who absolutely dreaded work meetings. total social phobia.
Steve's a great example of how anxiety isn't just one thing, you know?
Yeah.
It's this combo of factors, and a lot of times getting better means working on multiple areas.
Right. So he used this whole multifaceted approach,
Mhm.
breathing exercises, meditation, regular exercise to burn off tension. Even cutting back on sugar helped him.
It's amazing how all these things are connected, right? And it really highlights how there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Totally. What really struck me about Steve's story was how he used that gradual exposure we talked about. Like, he started with visualizing those meetings, then practicing with a friend, then finally going to the real thing.
It's a process, takes time, but it shows you how to break down these fears that seem impossible into steps you can handle.
Which brings us to Mike, whose OCD was so bad that the workbook actually suggested he needed extra help.
In his case, medication was key to breaking free from that cycle of obsessive thoughts. But the book's really clear. Medication's a tool, not a cure. It helps people get more out of those other techniques.
Like, it creates space for the other work to actually be effective.
Exactly. For Mike, they specifically mentioned clomipramine really helped reduce his obsessive thoughts about driving.
But it's super important to remember, medication is a personal choice. And you should always talk to a doctor first, right?
Absolutely. And it's not a replacement for therapy or those lifestyle changes we've been talking about.
Right. Okay, so one thing this workbook really emphasizes is that you are in charge of your recovery.
But they're careful to say that's not the same as blaming yourself.
Exactly. It's not about, this is all my fault.
It's more like realizing you've got choices in how you respond to these tough situations, even if you didn't choose the situation itself.
They have this really powerful quote in there. Even if you're not solely responsible for your disorder, you are the one responsible for holding on to it or doing something about it.
Wow, that really puts it in perspective.
It makes you think, like, where am I giving away my power? Where can I step up and actually take control?
That's a good question for all of us to think about.
Now, we're just scratching the surface here. The workbook goes way deeper into all these techniques, plus all sorts of other interesting stuff, like the importance of deep relaxation, not just for coping, but for preventing stress from building up in the first place.
Lowering that baseline level of anxiety so you're less reactive to everything.
Right. And it gives step-by-step instructions for something called progressive muscle relaxation, which I've heard is really effective.
It helps you become aware of all that tension you're holding in your body and, like, consciously let it go.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there. Shoulders all tense, jaw clenched. The book even talks about listening to calming music, especially at night. I'm a big fan of nature sounds before bed.
Makes a huge difference for sleep, which we know is so crucial when you're dealing with anxiety.
And of course, they call out all those excuses we make for not relaxing, right? I don't have time, nowhere quiet, it's boring.
We've all been there. But they're really pushing us to make relaxation a priority, just like brushing your teeth. Make it part of your day no matter what.
And the long-term benefits are worth it, right?
Right.
Way more than any short-term inconvenience. Now, this is something else I thought was really cool. The workbook actually talks about the spiritual side of anxiety. Like, sometimes it's a sign of a deeper existential crisis.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Like, what if anxiety is not the enemy? What if it's trying to tell us something?
Yeah, like that saying, what you resist persists. What if instead of pushing it away, we try to understand it? What's it trying to tell us about our lives?
Now, that's a powerful reframe.
So what do you think? Could anxiety sometimes be a sign we need to make a change, like align ourselves with our true purpose?
That's definitely something to ponder. And it's actually something we'll be exploring more in part 2 of this deep dive.
All right, so we talked about some of the things that cause anxiety and how important it is to tackle it from all angles. But I'm really interested in those specific things the workbook talks about. You know, the techniques. What can we actually do when anxiety hits?
Well, panic attacks are a good place to start because those can be really intense. The workbook is all about recognizing the early warning signs, like your heart's racing, you can't breathe, feeling dizzy.
That feeling of, oh crap, I'm losing it.
Exactly. But instead of getting swept up in those physical sensations, the workbook says you can actually interrupt that whole cycle.
Okay, how?
One thing they talk about is abdominal breathing.
Yeah, which we know can be super effective for calming down your nervous system.
Right. It also suggests things like calling a supportive friend, someone who can kind of ground you, or even getting some physical activity to help get rid of that nervous energy.
Sometimes even just distracting yourself helps in the moment, right? Like
Yeah.
counting backwards from 100 or focusing on something specific in the room. Anything to get your mind off those spiraling thoughts.
The key is to find what works best for you. Try different things. See what helps you feel more in control.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's panic attacks. What about phobias? Those fears that feel so intense, so irrational. We talked about exposure therapy before, which seems like the main way to approach that.
It is, but it's not as scary as it sounds. It's like, think of dipping your toe into a cold pool. Shocking at first, right? But the more you wade in, the more your body gets used to it.
So exposure therapy is about facing those fears, but little by little.
Exactly. You start with something that causes just a little bit of anxiety and then gradually work your way up. Like, say you're afraid of spiders. You might start by looking at pictures of them, then watching videos, then maybe you're in the same room as a spider, but it's in a safe container.
The key is to stick with each step until the anxiety starts to lessen.
Right. You're basically teaching your brain to see those situations as less threatening over time.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, something else the workbook gets into that I found really helpful was this whole idea of negative self-talk. It's like that inner critic that just never shuts up, and it can make anxiety so much worse.
Absolutely. A lot of it comes from those distorted thinking patterns. The cognitive distortions from the workbook. Like, imagine you're about to give a presentation. That thought pops into your head, oh God, I'm going to totally bomb this.
I've been there.
But that's what they call catastrophizing, jumping to the worst case scenario. Or you might think something bad's going to happen, even though it's probably not. Like, everyone's going to think I'm a fraud.
Okay, so step one is just noticing those thoughts, becoming aware of your inner critic. Right?
Exactly. And once you can do that, you can start to challenge those thoughts. So instead of, I'm going to bomb, maybe you ask yourself, hold on, what evidence do I have for that? Or what's the most likely thing that'll happen?
It's like those thoughts lose their power when you really examine them.
Right. And then you can start replacing them with thoughts that are more realistic, more helpful. So instead of, I'm going to bomb, it's, I prepared for this, I'm going to do my best.
It's that shift from beating yourself up to being kind to yourself, which can be so tough when anxiety has you in its grip.
It does take practice, definitely. But the workbook makes it clear you can change those thought patterns. That's not a life sentence.
Now, the workbook also talks about other important stuff for getting better, like deep relaxation. They have whole chapters on things like progressive muscle relaxation, which I've heard is amazing for releasing tension.
It really is. You tense and relax different muscle groups in your body step by step. The book gives you all the instructions.
And the goal is to reach this deep state of relaxation, both physically and mentally.
Exactly. And they emphasize that relaxation isn't just about coping with anxiety when it's happening. It's about preventing it in the first place.
By reducing that baseline level of stress we're all carrying around.
That's it. And of course, they talk about calming music, especially at night.
Oh, I love listening to nature sounds before bed.
It can really improve your sleep, and we all know how important that is for managing anxiety.
And the workbook isn't afraid to call out those excuses we all make for not relaxing. I don't have time. I don't have a quiet place.
It's too boring.
Right. Been there, done that. But they're encouraging us to make relaxation non-negotiable, part of our daily routine.
Just like brushing your teeth or taking a shower. Essential self-care, especially when anxiety is a factor.
Okay, so we talked relaxation. But what about the flip side? Exercise.
Oh, the workbook's all about that too. Regular physical activity is so important for managing anxiety.
It's like they say, motion creates emotion.
Exactly. Moving your body actually changes your mental state. Exercise releases endorphins, lowers those stress hormones, helps you sleep better.
Natural mood booster.
And it doesn't have to be crazy intense workouts. The workbook says find something you enjoy, something you can do regularly, like walking, biking, swimming.
Even dancing.
Exactly. The key is to find something that works for you and make it a habit.
Now, this is something I found really interesting. The workbook even talks about what you eat and how that affects anxiety.
Which makes sense when you think about it. Food affects our brains just as much as our bodies.
They specifically talk about the link between blood sugar and anxiety.
Right. They suggest cutting back on refined sugars and processed foods, because those can lead to energy crashes and mood swings.
And instead, focus on those whole, unprocessed foods. Fruits, veggies, lean protein, stuff that gives you sustained energy and supports your mental health.
Exactly. They also mention food sensitivities and allergies, how those can sometimes play a role in anxiety, which a lot of people don't realize.
So it might be worth looking into if you notice a connection between what you're eating and how you're feeling.
Definitely. The workbook also recommends certain supplements that can help with anxiety, things like B vitamins, magnesium.
Herbs like kava and valerian root.
But they stress that you should always talk to your doctor before you start taking any new supplements.
Good advice. Personalized guidance is always the best way to go. Now, one thing we haven't touched on yet is medication. What role does that play in anxiety recovery?
Well, the workbook acknowledges that medication can be a big help for some people, especially when anxiety is really severe and getting in the way of their life.
But it emphasizes that medication should always be used alongside therapy and those lifestyle changes.
It's not like a magic pill that fixes everything. It's just one part of a bigger plan. And it's really important to work with a good psychiatrist who can help you figure out the best treatment for you.
And to weigh the potential benefits and risks of any medication.
Absolutely. It's a personal decision that you shouldn't take lightly.
Now, in addition to all those practical techniques, the workbook also talks about some deeper aspects of anxiety recovery, like self-esteem.
Which can be so fragile when you're dealing with anxiety or a phobia. It's like a vicious cycle. Low self-esteem feeds anxiety, and then the anxiety makes your self-esteem even worse.
So how does the workbook suggest dealing with that?
It offers a bunch of exercises and affirmations for building self-compassion and self-acceptance. It's about recognizing that you're worthy, regardless of what you achieve or what you see as flaws.
Like giving yourself permission to be imperfect.
Exactly. To mess up sometimes. To be human. And to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend.
Now, another important piece the workbook touches on is healthy relationships.
Because our relationships can either help us or hurt us when it comes to mental health.
So true. So what does the workbook say about making those relationships healthy?
Well, it talks a lot about setting boundaries, which can be really hard for people who are always trying to please others.
Oh, yeah. Learning to say no without feeling guilty, that's a whole skill in itself.
It is. The workbook also talks about being assertive, expressing your thoughts and feelings clearly and directly, but without being aggressive or passive.
Finding that balance is key.
Right. And it gives you specific techniques for getting better at communication, like using I statements, focusing on behavior instead of personality, and making requests instead of demands.
It's about building relationships where everyone feels respected and supported, which is so important for feeling like you belong and are connected to others.
Abs.
Wow, we've covered a lot, but there's one more thing I want to bring up before we finish this part of our deep dive.
What's that?
That spiritual side of anxiety we were talking about earlier. The idea that it can sometimes be a sign of a deeper struggle, a feeling that something's missing in your life.
Ah, yes. The workbook says, exploring your spiritual beliefs and values can be a powerful part of healing.
It's about finding meaning and purpose in life, connecting to something bigger than yourself.
And sometimes it's about just accepting that there aren't always easy answers, that life is messy and unpredictable.
But even in those struggles, there's beauty and grace to be found.
I love that. It's about finding those things that nourish your soul, whatever they are for you. Whether it's meditation, prayer, spending time in nature, being creative.
Anything that brings you joy and reminds you that you're connected to something bigger than yourself.
Oh,
Okay, so we've talked about so much. Those in-the-moment things for handling panic attacks, the power of gradually facing your fears to overcome phobias, and how important it is to challenge those negative thoughts.
we also explored relaxation, exercise, nutrition, and the role medication can play. And those deeper parts of anxiety recovery, like self-esteem and having healthy relationships.
And of course, that spiritual side of anxiety, the idea that it might be nudging us towards something more meaningful.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about yet, something I think is essential for anyone who struggles with anxiety.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
We'll dive into that in part 3.
Right, so we've covered a ton. Practical techniques, that deeper stuff like self-esteem and purpose.
Right.
But you said there's one more piece of this whole anxiety puzzle. I'm hooked. What is it?
It might seem kind of strange when you're feeling all anxious and wanting to control everything, but it's really powerful.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's this idea of letting go.
Letting go. When you're anxious, that's like the opposite of what you want to do, right? You want
Yeah.
to grab on tighter, control everything.
It's a total paradox, right? The harder you try to fight anxiety, the more it seems to have you trapped.
So how do you even start letting go? What does that even look like?
Well, the workbook doesn't use that exact phrase, letting go, but it kind of dances around it in a few ways.
Like what?
One big one is acceptance. Accepting the anxiety, accepting your own limits, accepting the things you just can't change.
Oh, that's so hard. It feels so wrong. Like, shouldn't we be fighting anxiety, not accepting it?
The workbook says that fighting back actually makes you suffer more. It's like trying to swim upstream against a crazy strong current. You wear yourself out, but you don't get anywhere.
So acceptance is more like going with the flow.
In a way, yeah. It's about seeing what without judging it, without resisting it. And it doesn't mean giving up or thinking you're stuck with anxiety
It's
forever.
not passive, right?
It's about making space for healing. When you stop fighting, you have more energy to focus on the things you can change.
That makes sense. And it just occurred to me, those relaxation techniques we talked about, those are kind of a way of letting go too, aren't they?
Totally. When you're doing that deep breathing or that progressive muscle relaxation, you're letting go of tension, both in your body and your mind.
It's like giving yourself permission to chill out, to be still, to just be for a minute.
And in that stillness and that letting go, you might find a peacefulness that's really hard to get to when you're always striving, trying to control everything.
It's funny, even that quote we talked about before, about taking responsibility for getting better, isn't there some letting go in that too?
There is. When you take responsibility, you're letting go of that victim mentality. You're not blaming other people or your situation for your anxiety.
Which is empowering, because then you have some control.
Exactly. You get to choose how you react, even if you didn't choose what happened. And that choice, that can be really freeing.
It is. It's like taking back your power from the anxiety that's been holding you hostage.
Now, one last thought about this letting go thing. Remember how the workbook talked about anxiety having that spiritual side? Like, maybe it's a sign that something's off in your life, a nudge towards something bigger?
Right, like it's pointing us in a new direction.
What if letting go is also about surrendering to something beyond ourselves? Maybe it's trusting in a higher power, however you define that.
Whether that's God, the universe, or even just that inner wisdom we all have.
It's about having faith that even when things feel super uncertain and scary, you're not alone. You're supported.
I love that. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Anxiety and Phobia Workbook, maybe the biggest takeaway is this. Alongside all those practical tools and techniques, there's this deeper invitation to let go.
To accept what is, to trust the process, to have faith.
And in that letting go and that surrender, we might just find the freedom and peace we've been looking for.
That's beautiful.
Well, that's it for our deep dive, everyone. We hope you found this helpful, maybe even inspiring. Remember, you have the strength to get through this. Anxiety doesn't have to control your life.
And don't forget, there are people out there who can help. You don't have to do this alone.
Until next time, happy diving. And remember, you've got this.